I was there when she opened the box. Small, sealed, labeled in the particular handwriting of archivists. Careful, impersonal. The handwriting of people who understand that what they are recording will outlast the reasons it was recorded. She didn't look like someone chasing history, more like someone trying to correct it. She wasn't looking for answers. She was trying to prove something no one dared to say. That's what stayed with me, not the box, not what was inside it. The fact that she had already decided, before she opened anything, before she ran a single test, that the official story was wrong. Most people talk about Napoleon Bonaparte the way they talk about weather they didn't experience. A fact of history. Something that happened, was recorded and closed. The battles, the exile, the end. She didn't care about any of that. She cared about the end. Specifically, she cared about how a man who had commanded the largest armies in Europe, who had redrawn the map of the continent twice, who had been the most feared and most celebrated figure of his generation, how that man had spent his last years getting slowly, quietly, unremarkably sick on a small island in the South Atlantic, and died there at 51. They said he died of illness, something natural, something that made sense. She looked at me like that story was a lie, and the worst part, she had something to prove it. Saint Helena is a volcanic island in the South Atlantic Ocean, roughly halfway between Africa and South America. It is approximately 10 miles long and 6 miles wide. It has no natural harbor. In 1815, when Napoleon was sent there after his defeat at Waterloo, it took 3 months to reach by ship from Europe. That was the point. The British government, which had spent 20 years fighting Napoleon, was not going to make the same mistake twice. After his escape from Elba, his first exile from which he had returned, raised an army, and nearly recaptured France, they chose a location so remote that a second escape was essentially impossible. Napoleon arrived on Saint Helena in October 1815. He was 46 years old. He would never leave. He lived in a house called Longwood, which had been a barn converted into a residence, in a part of the island where the weather was persistently damp and cold. His household was monitored. His correspondence was read. His movements were restricted to a small radius around the property. He was allowed visitors, but not freely. He was given staff, but they were vetted. He spent 6 years there. In those 6 years, he declined. Slowly. Gradually. In the way that a person declines when they are sick, and the sickness is the kind that does not announce itself clearly, that presents as fatigue, as nausea, as a progressive weakening that any number of explanations could account for. He died on May 5th, 1821. His personal physician, Francesco Antomarchi, recorded the cause as stomach cancer. The British physicians who also examined him agreed on a gastrointestinal cause. That was the official record. That was what she did not believe. She was a forensic historian, the term she used for herself, though it was not yet a common designation when she began this work. She had spent years working with physical evidence from historical cases, materials preserved in archives, in museums, in the private collections of families who had held objects for generations without fully understanding what they held. She had come across a reference to a study published in 1961 by a Swedish toxicologist named Sten Forshuffud, who had spent years quietly obsessing over Napoleon's medical records. Forshuffud had noted that Napoleon's symptoms, the persistent nausea, The swollen legs, the excessive thirst, the sensitivity to light, the progressive weakness corresponded not to the profile of stomach cancer, but to the profile of chronic arsenic poisoning. He had then done something that no one before him had thought to do with the hair samples that had been preserved from Napoleon's time on Saint Helena. He had tested them for arsenic. The results had been unusual enough to publish, unusual enough to generate some academic discussion. And then, in the way of things that challenge comfortable narratives, they had been gradually set aside. She had not set them aside. She had gotten access to additional samples through institutional channels. Hair preserved in archives in France, in England, in private collections that had been quietly accumulating such things for 2 centuries. She had brought them to the lab. She showed me the first results on a Tuesday evening. I had come by at her request. She had been specific about the day and the time in a way that, in retrospect, meant she already knew what she was going to show me and wanted a witness present when she said it out loud. The lab was quiet in the way that labs are quiet late in the day. The ambient hum of equipment that never fully shuts down. The particular stillness of a room where thinking happens slowly and carefully. She pointed at the screen without saying anything. The numbers were there. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Same pattern, different sample, same result. She sat back slowly, as if moving too fast might disturb the reading. Then she said it, soft, almost to herself. The arsenic levels were too high to ignore. I told her it was probably contamination. Old samples, bad storage. Arsenic was common in Victorian-era environments, in wallpaper dyes, in fabric preservatives, in a dozen ordinary materials that people of that period used without concern. She didn't argue. She just ran the test again. The thing about arsenic in hair is that it tells time. Hair grows at a predictable rate, roughly 1 centimeter per month. Arsenic, when ingested, deposits in the hair shaft at the point of growth. A single strand, properly analyzed, becomes a timeline. You can see, month by month, what the body was absorbing. This is what made Forshuvid's original work striking. And this is what made her follow-up work something different. She pulled samples from multiple periods of Napoleon's time on Saint Helena. Early exile, middle years, the final months. She mapped the levels, what she expected to find, if the contamination theory was correct, if the arsenic was environmental, coming from the wallpaper or the damp or the general conditions of Longwood, was a relatively consistent background level throughout. Environmental contamination is not precise. It doesn't follow a schedule. What she found was more deliberate. The levels were high. They were consistent. And they were present across multiple samples from multiple time periods in a pattern that did not behave like environmental exposure. Environmental arsenic fluctuates. This didn't. It held. Steady. Too steady. She was quiet for a long time after the full picture came together. I was there. I watched her look at it. She wasn't excited. She wasn't triumphant. She had the expression of someone who has confirmed something they were hoping would turn out to be false. Then she said it. That wasn't poisoning. A pause. That was control. I felt it shift in the room when she said that. The difference between those two words. Poison kills fast. Poison is an event. What she was describing was not an event. It was a sustained, measured, repeated delivery of a substance that weakened without killing, that kept a man sick, kept him declining, kept him diminished and isolated and increasingly unable to be the threat he had spent 20 years representing. Not enough to kill. just enough to weaken over time. That is not an accident. Accidents don't plan. Environments don't measure. People do. She knew what this meant. I could see it in her face. Not shock, because she had been moving toward this conclusion for months. Something else. The particular weight of a theory that has stopped being a theory. I told her to stop, to call it contamination, write it off, walk away. She didn't even look at me. She said, "If I stop now, then it stays buried." She began to think about the people who had been present. Napoleon's household on Saint Helena included a small number of loyalists who had chosen to accompany him into exile, men and women who had given up their lives in France to remain with him. Among them was Charles Tristan de Montholon, a French general who had attached himself to Napoleon in the final period and who became one of the most significant figures in the Saint Helena household. Montholon controlled much of Napoleon's domestic environment. He managed the wine. He oversaw the kitchen. He had access to everything that passed through Longwood. After Napoleon's death, Montholon inherited a significant sum from Napoleon's will. Historians have noted these facts for 2 centuries. Some have drawn the connection. Others have argued that the evidence is circumstantial, that Napoleon's symptoms were consistent with stomach cancer, that the arsenic levels, while elevated, could be explained by the environment. She had heard those arguments. She did not find them sufficient, because there was one more thing she had noticed, which the environmental theory did not cleanly explain. The pattern of the levels corresponded, roughly, to periods when Montholon was present and periods when he was not. During an interval when Montholon had briefly returned to France on personal business, the levels showed a slight decrease. When he came back, they returned. She had not published this. She was not ready to publish this. She was still working, still checking, still trying to find the error she had not yet found. But she was starting to behave differently. I noticed small things. The way she double-checked the door before we talked. The way she saved her files to multiple locations. The way she paused sometimes before sending an email, as if considering who else might read it. I asked her once if she was worried. She said, "I'm careful. There's a difference." Then her emails started failing, not with error messages, just not arriving. Files she had stored in shared drives were showing access logs she didn't recognize. A folder she had been building for months appeared one morning to have been opened by someone who was not her. I told her it could be IT, routine maintenance, backups. She nodded and started keeping copies offline, encrypted, on physical media that she kept in locations she chose deliberately. That's when she came to me. Not dramatic, not panicked, just precise, the way she was about everything. She handed me a drive without much explanation, just enough. "I need you to hold this." I remember thinking that this was how it starts. Not with danger, with responsibility. I didn't want it. I took it anyway. And then she said the thing I couldn't forget afterward.
"If anything happens, I need you to remember."
Not report. Not prove. Remember. The last test came from a sample she described as the one that would close the gap. Hair taken from Napoleon in the final months of his life, preserved in a French archive for 200 years, logged and restricted, and still there. Still there, she said, because no one had thought to look at it the way she was looking at it. She worked through the night when the results came back. I wasn't there for that. She called me in the morning. She didn't say much. She said, "Come and see." I came. She laid everything out on the table. Every sample, every date, every line of data organized into a timeline that ran from 1815 to 1821. 6 years of evidence assembled into something that had the particular clarity of a thing that cannot be argued with. The arsenic wasn't random. It didn't spike. It didn't fade. It didn't behave like contamination from an environment, which varies with weather and season and the specific conditions of any given week. It held. Low. Consistent. Present throughout. Like a hand adjusting a dial. Just enough to keep someone declining. Just enough to keep them weakened, nauseated, unable to sustain the energy that would be required to plan, to organize, to be dangerous. She looked at me when she finished. Not proud. Certain. He wasn't meant to die quickly. A pause. He was meant to disappear slowly. I thought about Montholon after she said that. Charles Tristan de Montholon had been with Napoleon on Saint Helena from the beginning. He controlled the domestic arrangements. He managed the wine cellar. When Napoleon was ill, which was often and increasingly, Montholon was present. When Napoleon needed something prepared, Montholon oversaw the preparation. After Napoleon died, Montholon received 2.5 million francs from Napoleon's estate, more than anyone else in the household. Historians had noted this for 2 centuries. Some had considered it significant. Others had argued that Montholon was simply a loyal servant, rewarded for his loyalty. She had not decided which interpretation was correct. She had only decided that the pattern in the hair did not resolve itself through environment alone, and that the person with the most consistent access to Napoleon's food and wine was the person who had benefited most from his death. She was not accusing Montholon. She was describing a set of facts that had not yet been arranged into a conclusion. I thought about Saint Helena differently after that. I had always understood it as exile, the logical endpoint of a life that had burned too brightly for too long. A man removed from the world he had tried to reshape. But she was describing something else. Saint Helena was not just a prison. It was a controlled environment, a place where the person in it could be managed, his correspondence read, his visitors vetted, his household staffed with people whose loyalty was not only to him. A place where, if someone with access chose to act, there would be no second opinion, no independent physician, no family member in the next room, no one who was not already inside the system. It was not just about keeping him there, it was about controlling how he ended. Not in battle, not in public. Not as a martyr whose death could ignite another movement. Slowly, out of sight, out of question, until the man who had changed the world simply stopped. And the story that remained was the story that someone had decided to leave behind. She didn't get a warning. That's what still bothers me. Not the outcome, the absence of any process around it. The next morning, her lab access was denied, not with an explanation. Her badge simply stopped working at the door she had been walking through every day for 3 years. I tried to call her. Once. Twice. More than that. Silence. I went to the department office and asked about the project. The person I spoke to, a woman I had seen at departmental events, someone I recognized, looked at me with an expression I had not encountered before. Not hostile, not confused. Careful. Suspended, she said. Indefinitely. No details. No timeline. No explanation of what suspended meant in practical terms. I checked the research records. Her name was not there. Not removed, not crossed out. Just absent. As if it had never been entered. I went back to the lab hallway and stood there for longer than I should have. Same lights, same walls. The door she had walked through every day, now just a door. I had the drive she gave me. I waited a day before opening it again. Part of me was hoping it would make less sense the second time, that I would look at the data and find the error I had been expecting from the beginning. It didn't make less sense. Most of the files were there, organized, labeled, the product of months of work. Except one. The last one. The file from the final test. The one she had said would close the gap. It wouldn't open. Corrupted, the system said. I ran a recovery. Fragments came back, enough to see the structure of what had been there, enough to see that something was missing. Not at random, not the way data degrades from age or damage. A specific section. Gone. No explanation, no announcement, just silence. Errors are messy. Data loss is messy. Files fail in patterns that have their own logic, their own randomness. This was not messy. This was precise. I kept the drive. That's the part I don't say out loud. Not because I forgot, because I didn't. After she was gone, after the lab went quiet and her name stopped appearing in the places names appear, what was left felt like evidence that no one had asked for. I thought about releasing it, more than once. Late nights, the cursor blinking, everything one click away from being real. But truth like this doesn't land softly. It lands on people. It asks things of them. It requires them to reconsider something they have held as settled. Not just Napoleon's death, but the question of what else might have been managed in the same quiet way. I went back through her notes, carefully, trying to hear her voice in the reasoning. She had been methodical. She had anticipated the objections, the environmental contamination argument, the questions about chain of custody for 200-year-old samples, the problem of proving intent when the people who might have had that intent had been dead for 2 centuries. She had not tried to prove intent. She had only tried to prove pattern. The arsenic was real. The consistency was real. The correspondence with Montholon's presence and absence was real. The pattern in the final months, high and sustained, in a man who was dying of what his physicians called stomach cancer, was real. What it meant was a question she had left open, not because she didn't have a view, because she understood that open questions are harder to dismiss than closed ones. Because if she was right, then history didn't just forget the truth, it erased it. And that's a different kind of silence. Not absence. Intention. They said Napoleon Bonaparte died in exile. Simple. Clean. The ending that made sense for a story of that size. A man who had risen from nothing to reshape Europe, brought low finally by his own overreach, fading quietly on a rock in the South Atlantic, while the world he had tried to remake moved on without him. A natural death. A fitting end. That's the story. I remember what she found. I remember the numbers on the screen, the pattern that held across 6 years of samples, the expression on her face when she understood what she was looking at. I remember the drive she handed me. I remember the words she said when the timeline became clear. Not poison, not murder, but control. And the weight that word carried when she applied it to a man, to an island, to a system that had been built to ensure a certain kind of ending. I remember what it cost her. Her name is not in the record. The project does not officially exist. The file that would have closed the gap is corrupted in a way that is too precise to be random. And somewhere, in an archive in France or England, hair that grew from the head of a man who changed the world is still preserved, still waiting, still holding its timeline and the structure of each strand, still telling the same story to anyone willing to look. Some deaths are recorded. Others are arranged.